Sponsors. Our final presentation today focuses on an issue that we're all dealing with, but have very few real answers on how to approach. Allie Boyd, David Wade, and Rebecca Ivanoff will help us better understand how to navigate the changing demographics and changing needs of the next generation of lawyers. Allie Boyd is a 6-year associate with Davis Rothwell. She's licensed in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and practices in a variety of areas, including insurance defense, construction defect, employment, and product liability. Allie is also an active member of OADC and is the publications liaison for the Women in the Law practice group. David Wade is the 2021 president of the Oregon State Bar. He was a business trial lawyer in Eugene for 23 years and is now in-house at DCIPA Physician Services, LLC. For the first 16 years of his career, he practiced antitrust litigation in big cities around the country. He's a 1973 graduate of Harvard College and a 1976 graduate of Harvard Law School. Rebecca Ivanoff serves as Assistant Dean for Career Planning and Professional Development at the University of Oregon School of Law. In that role, she leads a team of professionals dedicated to supporting students and graduates in the pursuit of their unique career goals. She began her career as a business litigator with Miller Nash in Portland before joining the Lane County DA's office as an assistant district attorney. She is past chair of the Oregon State Bar Diversity Sections in Executive Committee and holds leadership roles with the National Association for Law Placement and various state bar communities. Welcome, Allie, David, and Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm the oldest, so I'll go first. I'm going to mostly talk about problems, and Rebecca and Allie are going to talk more about solutions. Ones you are all facing already, and they're not entirely new, but they are getting to a crisis stage. And I'm going to make this as brief as I can because statistics can get a little boring. But Allie, if you could show the first slide. In 2019, the Oregon State Bar paid for a climate survey, and they surveyed about 3,000 Oregon State Bar members. The Oregon State Bar, as you all know, is very thin on lawyers of color. And this chart, which is from about August of this year, shows those numbers. A lot of people decline to state, and some people are unknown. But for those who were willing to declare their background, you can see that Black lawyers represent less than 1%, Hispanic lawyers less than 2%, Asian lawyers about 3%. These percentages are vastly below the percentages in the general population. So they give rise to great concern at the Oregon State Bar about, are we providing lawyers who will make people in non-dominant cultures feel comfortable getting representation. So next slide. This shows the same issue by sexual orientation and disability. And I'm very confident that when you look at both of these areas, people who have a non-dominant sexual orientation and people who have a disability are vastly underreporting that because they're still frightened of the consequences of that being known. Next slide. All right, there's about an hour's worth of data in this one slide. This comes from our climate survey. The survey was done in the summer of 2019, so it's still pretty in date. And it's a little hard to read from a distance, and I cannot summarize all this data, so I just want to highlight a few things. So this was a survey done of all Oregon State Bar, or about 3,000 Oregon State Bar lawyers, and of every age, every sex, every gender orientation, every sex orientation, and every color. There were not enough Indigenous people responding to have a statistically significant response. We are doing another climate survey that's going to remedy that. But in the meantime, this chart shows across all age groups satisfaction of Oregon lawyers. And as you can see, for every single racial group and sexual orientation and disabilities, it is below 60% satisfaction, except for Asian Pacific Islanders, which is about 61%. That right there is telling us a lot. 60% of lawyers or less are having meaningful lived experiences as lawyers in Oregon. Remember, we advertise ourselves as being a better place to practice. We are not as adversarial. We are not as combative. We have better work-life balance. All those things is what we claim, but we're not even at 60% for everyone. And the most distressing column is likely to stay 5 years. That means at the time you answered this survey, you're likely to stay in Oregon 5 more years. And look at the dip. It's alarming. For Black people, it is devastating. It's below 20%. For non-dominant sexual orientations, it's below 30%. These are very disturbing numbers. So that was in July and August of 2019. The rest of the climate survey, which is available on our website, consists of the reports from focus groups asking different groups of people why they are dissatisfied, why they think they won't be here in 5 years. And the answers were many you would expect, but I just want to stress that the main ones are, for those who are lawyers of color, they're not getting mentored. They're not getting clients. They're not getting the level of experience that they see dominant culture lawyers getting. That is fixable. It's fixable, but it requires, number one, be aware of it, and number two, be aware of how to fix it. So I'm going to defer to Rebecca and Allie about that, but this chart I carry with me everywhere I go. I've toured Eastern Oregon. I'm going to tour Southern Oregon next week. I carry it with me everywhere I go because it bothers me so much. I think that's my last slide. And then I would like to add that the Multnomah Bar Association conducted its own survey in July 2020, so about 4 or 5 months into the pandemic. And I think their survey is also available on their website, Multnomah Bar Association, but I will just summarize very quickly. During COVID, dominant culture males were getting 9 hours of sleep a night, the same they get before COVID. Non-dominant women are getting 6.7 hours of sleep a night during COVID. Non-dominant males are getting 7.2 hours of sleep a night, and dominant females are getting 6.5 hours of sleep a night during COVID. A sure sign that the burdens of caregiving are falling on females and lawyers of color. Another very, very disturbing sign. All right, why is all this important? And I hope I'm preaching to the choir. Wholly apart from any political issues, which I'm not here to talk about at all, there is a business case for fixing this. And I think you all know this business case, but to me, the business case is number one, the general councils of larger.
I'll call you on your cell phone.
That's my sister. The general councils of larger corporations are insisting on women and people of color representing them. So the larger firms in Oregon stand to lose business if they cannot improve their numbers. Number two, the pool of graduates available for firms to hire from is fast moving toward female and increasingly people of color. A lot of that is due to efforts of the Oregon State Bar to bring diverse lawyers into the state. Three, this chart, not likely to stay for 5 years. No one in no demographic group did they say they wanted to stay here 5 more years. Losing those lawyers would be a devastating prospect. The cost of retraining, rehiring, reacclimatizing clients and so forth is devastating when you have more than 50% of your lawyers not wanting to be here in 5 years. So with that, all that good news, I will turn it over to Allie Boyd.
All right, thank you, David. I'm going to be probably reiterating a little bit of what David's just talked about, but my focus is really going to be approaching gender diversity in law firms themselves. As an initial step, I just want to clarify what I mean when I'm using the term gender or talking about male and female lawyers. This is an inclusive term, so it's identifying all people who identify as male and female. Another thing I want to address before I really dive into it is that you won't hear me talk much about people who identify as non-binary. And this is because there really isn't statistically significant data to talk meaningfully about trends within non-binary individuals entering the legal profession. I do want to point out, however, that there are studies being done by NALP and ALP, most recently in 2020, that showed that the number of law school graduates who identify as non-binary is increasing each year. And there are seemingly some trends starting to appear that show that they are several percentage points below their peers in hiring rates and starting wages. And overall, I just want to make a note that even if I'm not going to be talking in depth about this group, that they are an increasing group. There are over 1 million adults in the US who identify as non-binary, and we can likely expect more and more non-binary individuals to be joining the legal profession in the coming years. So when you and your firm are thinking about issues of gender, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's important to remember that non-binary individuals are part of that picture. Turning to the general topic of gender in law firms, I want to start by talking about where we were at before the pandemic. And the reason for that is I think that it's important to understand what the problem is. And the pandemic introduced so many major disruptions to the workforce that it's important to see what was the actual norm before that happened. And I'm going to show you, this is what the typical breakdown was pre-pandemic. And this comes from the 2019 numbers from the National Association of Women Lawyers. They do an annual report, and they've been doing that for well over a decade at this point. And there's a similar organization, National Association of Law Placement, that also does an annual survey that reflects very similar numbers. What this tells us is that pre-pandemic, we had huge issues with women being retained in law firms long enough to become partners. So what we see is that for several years now, law students graduating from law schools are predominantly female, somewhere between 50 and 55%. And then what we also see is that private law firms are hiring associates at nearly equal numbers. In 2019, 47% of associates were women. However, we start to see big drop downs as we get into the realm of non-equity and equity partnership. So the most recent numbers pre-pandemic were that about 30% of non-equity partners were women and about 20% of equity partners were women. And what's most concerning about that is the lack of progress. So the graph you're looking at may look like the world's most boring line graph because it just isn't budging. But we see, this is just numbers that I grabbed from the National Association of Women Lawyers surveys from 2014 to 2019. And we see our gains in percentage points of maybe 1 to 2%, but overall, we are still seeing a very flat level of progress where we are seeing good rates of associate employment, but we are not seeing significant increases in women in the non-equity partnership tier. And then again, we are not seeing increases in the equity partnership tier. So what this tells us, gains have been incremental at best. And I think it's really important in this time to talk about, even though I'm focusing on gender, that it's really not separable from the discussion of racial diversity. And the reason for that is that the experiences of women of color and white women in the legal profession may be shared, but they're not identical. And what we see is gains that are being made in gender diversity in the legal profession are primarily among white women. So instead of just talking about the problems, I do want to talk about a couple of places that I really recommend that firms look. One of them is the paper Left Out and Left Behind, which was created by the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession. The ABA Commission on Women in the Profession actually produces a lot of great material about this, but the Left Out and Left Behind report is a retrospective looking at efforts to diversify the legal profession. And what that paper showed was that they have found that all women may face similar obstacles in professional careers as lawyers, but women of color also face other unique challenges. So to give some examples, there was an ABA study called Visible Invisibility, which showed some of the obstacles and biases that women of color have identified. These include being denied networking opportunities, missing client development opportunities, being denied promotions, and having difficulty meeting billable hour requirements and building a book of business necessary to advance in their firms. A more recent 2018 study from the ABA showed that one really interesting statistics that jumped out at me, 57% of women of color have been confused for custodial, administrative, or courtroom staff. White male lawyers reported only 7% had that same experience. More than half of women of color who are lawyers in the courtroom have that experience. And what is perhaps most telling about all of this information is that more recent studies in 2019 and 2020 show that women of color are actually more likely to seek advancement and be top executives than white women, and they're more likely to aspire to attain promotions than men. So what that tells us is that women of color do not have a lack of desire to advance into partnership tracks, but they are not feeling that they have the opportunities to pursue that and develop their career. With that, I want to talk about the effect of the pandemic. So what I'm showing you is a graph created by the US labor force participation by gender. This is national US labor force, is not specific to the legal profession, but that's mostly because we do not quite have all of the data that tells us the impact specifically upon lawyers. What we do know is that the pandemic obviously caused huge unemployment rates for all workers in the US workforce, but it had a very disproportionate impact upon women. So before the pandemic, in February of 2020, and by before the pandemic, I mean before we started having lockdown orders and we saw our economy slow in the US. Before that time, women made up more than half of the US workforce for the first time in our history. But this rapidly changed in the first weeks and months of the pandemic. Men's unemployment rates peaked somewhere between 13 and 14% in the first few months of the pandemic, and women's unemployment rates peaked about 2 percentage points higher than men. And for much of 2020, that continued to track at being about 2 percentage points higher. But what's interesting is that we also saw a huge dropout of women in a specific age bracket of 26 to 44 years old. So if we're thinking about primarily the years of being parents of minor children, we saw nearly 1/3 of all women in the workforce of that age bracket, 26 to 44, drop out. The equivalent number of men was 12%. So hugely greater number of women dropping out of the workforce due to the pandemic. So what happened? Why did this happen? There are a few reasons, some of which are not applicable to the legal profession. One of them is that the types of jobs employing women were disproportionately affected by COVID. And another one is that jobs held by women typically carried greater risk of exposure to COVID. This is because women in general in the US are more likely to be working in public-facing jobs such as hospitality, retail, and food service. But the third issue is the most relevant to the legal profession and working women in general, and that is the burden of childcare and elder care largely fell upon women. And this is something that David mentioned, but I want to dive a little bit more into this. As I mentioned, that age group of 26 to 44 years old saw nearly 1/3 of all women in the workforce drop out. And we might ask, well, how do we know this is due to, childbearing and childcare and elder care? Well, as I said, a big clue is the age group of where the women dropping out of the workforce were concentrated. The second is that when we compare the US with other countries, we actually see that we have very similar levels of women leaving the workforce, even though the United States is much more evenly spread across industries. So whatever is causing women to leave the workforce during the pandemic transcends industry. And the third, and perhaps most important for us, is that there are unbelievable numbers of anecdotal stories of women lawyers across the country describing how they had to drop out or drop down to part-time work in order to take care of their family. One source that I recommend people look at is a article that was published in the ABA magazine this summer, highlighting some of those stories. So what we know is that parents of minor children noted an increase in parenting time overall, regardless of gender. But what we understand is that women reported much greater increases in parenting time. Particularly, men might have experienced an increase of roughly 2 hours in parenting time, whilst women reported that to be increasing up to 6 hours per day. So what the data tells us is that when in-school learning, daycare, and other external sources of childcare were removed by the pandemic, the burden largely fell on working women, and many of them had to leave the workforce or drop down to part-time. So where does that leave us as a profession? Well, there is some good news in the numbers that are coming out of 2020. What we do see is that women still made up more than half of all law students. That has not dropped. We also know that women were still making up roughly half of all associates getting hired out of law schools, and they were actually more than half of summer associates at private firms. However, the gap does persist when it comes to partners, both equity and non-equity. So it does appear that while firms are getting better at hiring and recruiting women lawyers, we've not figured out how to retain them long enough to become partners. The pandemic is something I wanted to highlight because we still don't know how this is going to impact our long-term outlook. We do know that the Great Recession starting in 2008 caused a huge drop in diversity in private law firms. So it's very possible there will be similar effects here. However, the pandemic is unique as compared to the Great Recession because it has impacted women more strongly than men, whereas the typical recession impacts men greater than women. So, like David said, we do want to talk about solutions. So what comes next? So there are a lot of solutions that people have recommended that can help to foster a firm that keeps women, and particularly women of color, in the workplace. one of the things is to adopt best practices for reducing biases in decision making. What this means is that firms can examine who is making decisions, how they're making decisions, and whether those decisions consider the potential for bias. Another solution is to improve access to effective and engaged mentors. As David mentioned, a huge important aspect is having mentors who can not only help you develop professionally, but connect you with people who can help you develop your career further. Another potential solution is to incorporate an intersectional approach to gender and diversity. And this is something that I touched upon earlier, but it's important to recognize that you can't really talk about gender without talking about racial diversity. So for example, grouping, say, all women together when examining pay equity within your firm may lack necessary nuance by focusing on women in general and not talking about, say, white women versus women of color. Another area in which solutions can be found is just working to create a more inclusive culture. And the last one is that we can take lessons from the COVID era. We can maintain the COVID era flexibility with schedules from work from home situations and other mobile help and tools to ease the tension between career and family that many women feel and that have been seemingly exacerbated by COVID and all of its shutdowns and regulations. So, general takeaways, we still have a long way to go with gender and diversity and inclusion in private firms. That held true prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic likely is to exacerbate these issues and maybe even slow down our progress. However, there are many more tools now to help us both technically and practically with giving people that flexibility, but also with working to implement some of these solutions I've mentioned. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Rebecca, who I believe will be talking more about law students and where we're headed in that direction.
Thanks so much, Allie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ivanoff. I'm Assistant Dean for Career Planning and Professional Development at the University of Oregon School of Law. And I just want to thank OADC for including me and inviting me to share the law school perspective in this important discussion on the increasing diversity within our law students and legal professionals within the state of Oregon, and strategies to effectively retain lawyers from backgrounds historically underrepresented in the profession. In terms of structure for my part of this discussion, I'm just going to kind of talk at the 30,000 foot level about what we look like in terms of law school enrollment, and the law student profile in Oregon and the folks that will be graduating both this year and in years to come. I'm going to speak briefly about some issues that students experienced during the pandemic that I think are really relevant for legal employers to consider as they're thinking about how to retain, recruit and retain diverse talent. And I want to share some suggestions and tips on how to create an inclusive community. As Allie mentioned, you know, the key is really creating a sense of belonging and a culture that fosters, you know, diverse attorneys and the expression of those identities, and has not just talking points around their support for DEI, but actual policies and practices in place that enhance that feeling of belonging and allow people to really show up as their full selves. Before I jump in, I want to just acknowledge that I'm going to use the term diverse students and diverse lawyers to encompass a broad range of folks with salient identities that include those who have been historically underrepresented in the practice of law. So that's kind of shorthand for people of color, first generation college and law students, people with a wide variety of gender identities and expressions, members of our LGBTQIA+ community, students with disabilities, and those with neurodiversity. And when I say neurodiversity, I'm talking about folks who might have ADHD or might otherwise find themselves on the spectrum, who are very talented students and future lawyers. And we need to consider that brain variance is actual a normal part of brain function. And so as we're thinking about how to create inclusive spaces, we don't want to leave these folks out. I also want to share that the tips and strategies that I'll discuss today are drawn from the 2020 version of the National Association for Law Placement's Diversity Best Practices Guide For those unfamiliar with NALP, you heard a reference to the organization earlier. It's an association with over 2,500 legal career professionals who advise law students, lawyers, law offices, and law schools in North America and beyond. NALP members come together in the common belief in three fundamental things. First, that all law students and lawyers benefit from a fair and ethical hiring process. Second, that law students and lawyers are more successful when they're supported by professional development and legal career professionals. And third, a diverse and inclusive profession best serves clients and our communities. This guide that I'm going to talk about is actually publicly available, and I'll make sure to share that link with the organizers today so they can share that out with you for your later reference. So turning to the law school admission cycle, 2021 saw the largest wave of applicants in the past decade. And we really believe that that bump is due to many things: the economic downturn, the recent election, the racial, social, and climate justice movements that are occurring across our country and around the globe, among other things. And this generation of students that we're seeing is really interested in doing something and creating positive change. At the U of O, we actually had a 40% increase in our application volume and enrolled a slightly larger class with 175 first-year students on orientation day. I just came from another meeting with the deans of the other two law schools, and I know that they similarly experienced bumps in their admission cycle. And we saw that across the country as well. So many people wanting to go to law school, many folks from diverse backgrounds wanting to pursue a legal education. In terms of demographic trends, as with most law schools, Oregon Law is continuing its efforts to enroll the most diverse, motivated, and talented law school class possible. And that means more students from these groups who have been historically excluded from the profession. In our class this year, among 1L students, we welcomed our largest percentage of women in the class at 59%. 27% of our students identify as students of color, and 25% of our students are self-identified as members of the LGBTQIA+ community. And we have seen over the years that number continuing to increase with respect to students who identify as a person from a historically underrepresented group. And I think it's really exciting to think about what that means for the future of law practice in Oregon. And it definitely, as you've heard, there are systemic and historic barriers that have existed to people of color being successful in Oregon in particular. And so we've had to work with intention to attract students from diverse background, and particularly students of color to Oregon. And we have to work with intention, and have done so with our bar partners, to create inclusive culture while students are in law school, to encourage them to want to stay here after graduation. The first step in having these diverse classes is creating a pipeline to the profession. And I'm really proud that at the University of Oregon, we actually host a pre-law undergraduate scholars program. And that's designed to support students from diverse backgrounds just with their exploration of law school in general as an option for them, and to help them cultivate the skills necessary to succeed in law school. So this creates a pipeline of diverse students to the profession, and we hope to Oregon directly, and in some cases to U of O directly. So we're proud to be in our second year with that program. And I know the other law schools in Oregon are similarly invested in initiatives to recruit and retain diverse law students. Once students arrive, we really work with intention to connect diverse law students with mentors who reflect their unique identities. And I'll address this later in my comments, and you've heard from my colleagues on the panel today, but creating and building a sense of community is crucial for a student's sense of belonging and their overall success in law school, and then later in the workplace and in the profession. And as kind of a last initiative, we partner with intention, as I mentioned, with legal employers throughout the state of Oregon and with our bar partners to really create those robust connections for professional mentors and career opportunities for students from diverse backgrounds. I'm just going to briefly kind of echo some of the things you heard about the impact of the pandemic. So as the profession and legal education transitioned to a fully remote environment, I know it's, I'm not telling anyone anything new when I say we were forced to innovate and adapt. And our students became adept at working and learning remotely and collaborating with colleagues and employers using technology. They were adaptable, resilient, and ready to meet the challenges of the moment. But it wasn't without its hurdles, right? And so, you know, just like lawyers, our students were juggling the stress of the pandemic, childcare related challenges, healthcare related challenges, and being stretched very thin, trying to manage all the things, doing so remotely. You know, it's interesting to think about as well, when we look at the students who are about to graduate, those soon-to-be lawyers spent over half of their legal education online, okay, and working online and studying online. So I just like to drop that here. So as you're thinking about recruiting and onboarding new talent, there will be perhaps a learning curve with some folks as we return our workplaces to in-person more and more. I know we're back at the law school, but many folks are still working remotely on this call. So we're certainly not out of it. But thinking about ways for all new lawyers coming in, not just lawyers who identify as women or otherwise a person from an underrepresented background in the profession, but to be intentional about how you onboard those folks and really weave those folks into the fabric of your firm culture. It's more challenging in a remote environment, but the investments that you make on the front end will pay dividends with respect to, I think, productivity, sense of community, and retention long term. So one thing I'd be remiss to note, though, is that, you know, just like we're seeing everywhere in the profession, there are some serious mental health challenges. You know, folks are experiencing depression and anxiety at higher rates, and students are really interested in focusing on wellness and are interested in workplaces that have, you know, really programs set up to support work-life balance and mental health and wellness in that way. And I think it's really important for us to normalize the conversations around mental health challenges and some of the challenges that we're facing day to day. I'm going to speak later about this in my presentation, but you know, the thing that I think leads to attrition is this sense of isolation, right? And when we feel like we are the only ones experiencing, whether it's imposter syndrome or a lack of seeing ourselves reflected in firm leadership or leadership within the profession, that can be very isolating. And particularly when we're wrestling with depression or anxiety, feeling like that's not something I can talk to my boss about, that's going to be a problem, right? And so when you think about retention programs for all of your attorneys, I just really encourage everybody here to think through, what are you doing around work-life balance? What are you doing around wellness? And how can you normalize those conversations in the workplaces so that people can bring their full selves to the job, which is where they're going to be most productive and in their space to thrive. So, you know, things we've noticed about this newest generation of lawyers, like I said, they want to make an impact. They have a wide variety of legal interests. They care, as I said, about work-life balance, and they're resilient, and they've learned to work from anywhere. So you're bringing people on as you look to the future of the profession here in Oregon that have skills in technology, kind of have expectation around technology and some flexibility with respect to scheduling that you'll want to think through as you're crafting offers and creating onboarding programs for them. So I'm going to dive right in to strategies for retention and creating firm culture that really values diversity, equity, and inclusion. First and foremost, it comes down to your firm leadership, not just being vocal supporters, but active participants in this DEI work. So we want people that talk the talk and also walk the walk. And you know, before we even get into DEI programming, I think it's really important for our leaders within our spaces to really value authenticity, because lawyers who are authentic, leaders who are authentic, create space for those that they're supervising to be the same way. And I'm not going to pretend like this is easy, or maybe it's historically been modeled within our profession, but those that are able to create a sense of belonging and value for the team members bringing their unique selves to the workplace are those who are able to model it themselves. And as I mentioned, research, I have a colleague in NALP who's done some valuable research around this idea of the profession valuing sameness. So practicing in the same way, kind of dressing exactly in the same way, presenting in the same way, looking a certain way. That has led to a space where people feel like they have to mute their unique characteristics and individual personalities in order to fit in. And we heard David mention this when the bar gathered anecdotal evidence about what is creating this dissatisfaction within the employment community here in Oregon for diverse attorneys. It's this feeling like they're never, this feeling that they can never achieve whatever this standard is for people to be exactly the same. They can't show up as their full selves. So again, leading to feelings of disconnection and separation. And it's leaders who are able to create the space for them to bring forward experiences that are likely different than their own. Because when you're serving as a manager for a team of diverse attorneys who have different lived experiences than you, creating the space for people to be able to talk about that, say what it's like to maybe be the only one in your firm, depending on how large it is, or the only one in the courthouse that day that might express, their self-expression is one that's not represented elsewhere, to be able to talk about what would be supportive of them, and as a leader to really listen, because that's how firms are going to be able to retain their talent, is if they're asking for the information, listening without judgment, and then implementing change based on what they hear. So I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for authentic leadership at the beginning. So I'm going to kind of go through a list here, and we're going to have some time for question and answer here at the end, but I'm going to give you some concrete steps you can take to really enhance systems or develop systems that can enhance retention of diverse attorneys. So number one, analyzing existing systems and policies for either the unintended or historic bias that exists. And we heard this mentioned by Allie earlier, is really taking a deep dive into those systems that exist. And by that, I mean, what does your firm's work allocation system look like? Is there somebody that's in charge of making sure that attorneys, all new attorneys, are receiving high quality work assignments and the mentorship, guidance, and feedback that they need? What's your process for inclusion at firm events? Do you have more senior folks in the firm reaching out with intentional invitations to your newer attorneys, creating community in that way? What do the internal training programs look like? And does the content need to be updated, right? And might you need to bring in someone with additional expertise that might not exist in your firm to be able to address the issues that are most relevant for incoming attorneys? And then what's the committee appointment process? Are all new attorneys getting equal access, equitable access to high quality committee assignments, and being encouraged to engage in community organizations and leadership positions? This is a really important piece of ensuring that there are systems that help people feel a sense of belonging, and then also a desire to stay. Other things, requiring annual reports by practice area leaders on the goals and efforts to diversify their individual practice groups, and then tying outcomes to the goals and to the evaluation of that particular work group. Making the firm's leaders accountable for meeting those DEI goals. And when I say DEI, I mean diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Including the achievement of goals as a factor in the compensation process. As we know, when one's overall annual review and compensation package is tied to the achievement of certain goals, including DEI within that set of goals that are tied to compensation, can be a real motivator for folks that might not otherwise be inclined to pursue this kind of work and education. Encourage all firm members to participate in women's, LGBTQIA, and minority bar association and minority council programs. sponsor memberships in these associations and fund participation at events, buy tables to the annual events and encourage participation from throughout the firm, not just those that might hold identities represented by that particular organization. And then really partner with affinity bars. We have a really robust network of affinity bars here in Oregon. It's a small but mighty group, and they are interested in helping your organizations identify and recruit diverse lateral attorneys. And I'm going to put a plug in. You heard I am a former chair of the Oregon State Bar Diversity Sections Executive Committee. I'm going to put a plug in for the work they're doing. We just had the convocation on equality this past November 5th. It was a great training on some of these same issues. The DEI section and many other sections are doing great work in this regard. So look out for those programs and advertise them in your weekly correspondence as an organization. Another thing, count DEI related activities toward the firm commitment or otherwise qualified billable hours minimum. That can really encourage participation in this important work. And then of course, providing reasonable accommodations for folks with disabilities so that they can meet their maximum productivity. And I would just say, a couple of other ideas here, instituting an anonymous upward review process with DEI as a central component. So it allows those junior level members of your firm to give really honest feedback at the leadership level. And, I think a lot of us know, oftentimes you're a really great lawyer and that's the way you ascend in a firm, but you might not necessarily have had kind of management training or leadership development training. Making those investments in your team leaders and your firm leaders to the extent that you're hearing from kind of your newest associates on up that there might need to be some shifts in that area. And that's what I mean about gathering that feedback and responding once you get it. And I'll acknowledge that I think the step around the anonymous feedback really is going to invite things from people who are not comfortable otherwise sharing it face to face. As we heard from David earlier, even with the BARS survey, we have a lot of folks who, for a lot of reasons, might not want to share this in a way that can be identifying, but we still get important information when we gather that data in an intentional way. And I want to echo what Allie said about sponsors and mentors. So aligning your incoming talent with mentors in the organization who are going to help guide their path, help make introductions to folks, be there to answer questions when they come up, but then also separately to have sponsors. And these are people that are in powerful positions within the organization that have the capacity to make sure that that new diverse attorney's name is being put forth for high quality work assignments, for committee assignments, and for other engagements that are important to the firm. This is, again, a way to make people feel a sense of belonging and know that they have someone within the organization that's helped guiding their career, which is central to creating a desire to stay with new talent. Couple of points on culture and inclusion. I think it's really helpful if organizations can think about creating a DEI vision statement, and then that outlines the firm's commitment to DEI work, and then disseminating that not just internally within the organization, but to your clients, right? And so creating spaces where you can put forth that vision statement. And then again, implementing firm-wide DEI strategic planning, incorporating measurable benchmark goals, and then doing that evaluation process, tying the attainment of those goals to that annual review. There are a lot of great suggestions in the best practices guide from NALP. So I'm not going to go over all of them, but what I'm hopeful is that with this list, you're getting a few kind of takeaways that I recognize because of NALP's membership, which often skews towards the larger firms, that some of these points might not be immediately transferable to folks who are joining from smaller or mid-sized firms. But my hope is that you might get some nuggets that feel like they could work to help address culture within your organizations, and that it just sparks a conversation. And again, I'll put in a plug for NALP. Much of the content is available publicly. And it's there designed to increase satisfaction in the profession and certainly to further DEI initiatives. Additional thoughts on how you can kind of attract diverse candidates. Partner with your law schools. I can speak confidently on behalf of all 3 law schools saying that we want to work with you to help our diverse law students find opportunities. Work with the Oregon State Bar, which I'm really excited about. A couple of programs I want to talk to you about. Have your firm's attorneys volunteer for OLEO, which is Opportunities for Law in Oregon. It's a program that's designed to introduce diverse incoming law students to the state of Oregon with diverse lawyers and judges who work and practice in Oregon. Again, to create a sense of community, create a desire for these incoming students to stay and practice. There's the OLEO Employment Fair, and I know would be welcome as an employer to have a table at that fair so you can meet with diverse law students. Volunteer for the mentorship programs that I know each and every one of our law schools is hosting to get students really connected. And then additionally, once lawyers are joining your firms, think about putting them forth for the Oregon State Bar's Leadership Academy. And this is a new initiative, and David might want to say more about this at the close of our comments. This new initiative is again designed to help retain diverse talent here in Oregon. And it's a really exciting program. I've been privileged to work on the planning committee for that trains diverse lawyers in a variety of leadership skills and gives them exposure to different kind of career planning, content, and personal development, business development skills. And so it's something to think about when the application process comes up again for next year's cohort. We were excited to see, I want to say we have 12 in our first cohort, but we have capacity for more. So think about putting forth attorneys on your teams for those types of opportunities. Lastly, I'm going to use an example around pronouns on how to create welcoming culture and a culture that helps people feel seen. So instituting a policy that enables prospective and current employees to identify their gender pronouns can be really helpful. And this can be things like creating space for it on your application form, using pronouns in your email signature block, on business cards, and on name badges. And I'll say that having firm partners lead by example in this way in identifying their gender pronouns, it helps to create an environment in which associates and staff members also feel comfortable in doing the same. And I'll acknowledge, all of us are on a journey, like there's always more to learn, right? And so just start with wherever you're at. But I'll say that this was one I learned a lot about when I went to the law school. And as a person that uses gender pronouns that align with my physical presentation and my name, at first blush, one might think, well, why would you be sharing your gender pronouns? The idea is that by doing it personally, and you'll see I do it in my Zoom signature or my name, as I can see David has his here too, it doesn't put all the weight on those who might not identify on the binary or might use gender neutral pronouns to have to explain. It really creates a culture of inclusion where folks feel free to do this. And I guess the obligation or burden, if you will, to explain to others why we might be acting in a certain way doesn't just fall to the individuals who would be most impacted by it. And the idea there is around allyship. And, all of us have the capacity to be allies to new folks in our organizations and to others in the profession. And so I just wanted to highlight that as just one example as a way to create a culture that's inclusive and more welcoming. So I am the last speaker on what has been a very long day. I'm cognizant of that. I know no one will be disappointed if we end early. I just want to thank you all again for inviting us to have this really important discussion. I learned so much listening to David and Allie's presentations. I'm excited to continue the conversation. I'm also privileged to be a lawyer in this state where I know that there are lots of really good people putting a lot of thought into these topics and who are interested in knowing more, learning more, doing better. And so it is a privilege, as David mentioned. This is a community that is collegial, and we pride ourselves on being welcoming and collegial. And I think it's exciting that there are so many people that are interested in this topic. So I want to thank you all for staying around till the end of the day and joining us for the conversation. And I think we have about just shy of 20 minutes for questions. So I'll kick it back to Allie, who I also want to thank and acknowledge, because her work and her article for your organization is what prompted the invitation for this panel. So kudos to you, Allie, for your work. And thanks again for inviting me to be a participant.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I'm not sure if we have any questions. I don't know if our host, Megan, can tell us, but we're open for questions. I think that the chat is available for people. You can ask us that way, or you can just hop on and ask.
No questions. I had a question, and apologies if I missed any information during the presentation, but is there anything that the law schools are working on to better prepare or kind of arm law students to succeed, in private firms? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm really excited to share. At the University of Oregon, we have a program that starts as soon as the first year. So it's our career exploration and professional planning class. And it's a way to get students thinking very intentionally about their career path and their existing skill set, and maybe some gaps in their skill sets that they could shore up through employment opportunities in that first and second year summer, and also through clinics and what many on this call might remember as externships. We now call field placements, thanks to the ABA, but basically experiential education that they can undertake during law school. And because those 3 years go so quickly, we are talking to them really from day one about what the legal landscape looks like in terms of employment opportunities, the importance of mentorship, and the cultivation of robust professional networks, because the reality is that the majority of folks land their jobs through word of mouth connections and their own individual hustle and outreach to employers. So we're trying to get students really comfortable with making that ask for an informational interview, or attending that now remote, often CLE presentation, and staying around in Q&A to talk to the speakers. And certainly, the hard skills around, legal research and writing. I'm really proud of the fact that Oregon has the top ranked program in the country for LRW, and my colleagues in Oregon and our partner schools also have really strong, robust programs to allow students to cultivate the skills that will allow them to hit the ground running in practice. I will say, we are graduating first year lawyers, not fourth year lawyers. So there's always, there's some training that certainly is going to need to happen on the firm side, but we're working with a lot of intention around getting students experience during law school that wasn't the norm. Several years ago, I want to say the ABA's report came out in 2007 about the gap between legal education and law practice. And so the schools have really been working with intention to kind of address that gap ever since. And so I know, again, not just at University of Oregon with the class, I know Lewis and Clark and Willamette and many other schools across the country have these professional development programs that are designed to get them ready with the skills they'll need to be successful as summer associates and also first year lawyers.
That's great to hear. To piggyback on that, I am pleased to announce that OADC is going to be rolling out a new first year free for new members. So that might be attractive to law students to get some practical experience before they start, maybe, in practice in their career. So we'll be trying to get the word out on that program. Thank you. This was an amazing presentation. I was pretty impressed by how much work we have to do, but also encouraged on how much change is already taking place. And you can tell that a lot of time and effort was put into this. So thank you so much.
We did get a query in chat from Heather about the alternatives to the bar exam. Rebecca and I are on that committee, along with the dean of the Willamette Law School, and we are very far along. We made a report to the Oregon Supreme Court. They sent back a list of questions. We're about to answer those. And I think, frankly, we're going to get a decision early next year from the Oregon Supreme Court. Basically, the two ideas on the table are, one, that for JDs who do not want to take the bar exam, we are going to offer the QEP, or rather OEP, the Oregon Experiential Path. And what Dean Ivanoff was talking about, which is ramping the law schools up to actually teaching how to practice law, not just think about it, but how to practice law. If this comes off, and I think it will, the law schools will be offering 15 hours in the last term of experiential, practice-oriented instruction. Board of Bar Examiner volunteers will be actually in the law school to look at these students' work product. And if it looks like they're able to practice law, they will be admitted to the bar the day they graduate from law school without taking the bar exam. This will give them 4 more months of work where they can work as lawyers instead of, you know, eat peanut butter and study for the bar exam. It will save them the cost of the Barbary courses, and we think it's going to enhance the quality of lawyers in Oregon. The second pathway is the SPP, which is for those lawyers who don't go to an Oregon law school and therefore could not do the OEP. They can sign up for 1 year of apprenticeship here with an Oregon lawyer. And again, a Board of Bar Examiner will go into that law firm and look at this JD's work. And if at the end of that year, they are able to practice law, then they can join the bar without taking the bar exam. Again, they don't lose work time, they don't pay Barbary, and they can be from any place in the country.
If I can just piggyback on what David offered, you know, this is actually the call I just came from before this meeting. And I can say that, you know, in addition to myself and David and Dean Galini from Willamette, the work group actually included stakeholders from all across the community, interested parties, students, employers, BBX folks, among others, and it represented a significant amount of investment in exploring what alternatives to the exam could look like. Just a point of clarification that kind of came through with public comments, and some of you, if you've been thinking about it, maybe wrestling with it, I want to just say that this doesn't replace the UBE bar exam test. We were actually charged with looking at what additional alternatives could effectively measure competency for admission to the bar in Oregon. It does not change the competencies required in order to admit to the bar here. And every lawyer that's applying to admit would still have to successfully pass the professional responsibility exam and meet every other admission requirement. We're excited because, you know, well, I'll say we saw in the public comments, there's certainly the camp of the bar exam tests the necessary competencies for admission, and then the camp that's kind of in the place of thinking the bar exam is a hazing tool or not as effective at measuring actual competency. What we know for sure is that competent lawyers are not always admitted through the bar exam only. And so we want to look at additional ways that they might be. A cool thing about the proposal, if the state Supreme Court adopts it, is that a student actually doesn't have to choose. So they might, and I know David mentioned the credit hours, 15 credit hours. You know, the exact requirements would be outlined in the implementation phase. What I can say is the Oregon Experiential Pathway it would be an enhancement of what the law schools are already doing with respect to experiential education. It would require even more. in terms of hands-on experience. And we studied a similar program in New Hampshire, and what we saw was that it's incredibly rigorous. It takes a lot of investment as law students to meet the requirements, the threshold requirements to admit immediately after graduation, and that it's not a path that's going to be open to everyone. And so, if a student would be interested in it initially, they could still change their mind and elect to sit for the UBE. And frankly, people who graduate successfully through a program like that might still sit for the UBE because there's portability with the score to other jurisdictions. So from an employment standpoint, it opens up additional options. I think for the employers on this call, what's exciting is if it's adopted, that when you hire a person that went through the Oregon Experiential Program, this is a person committed to practicing in Oregon. And you can rest assured that they have developed the skill sets necessary to be successful as entry-level attorneys and to competently practice law. Additionally, as David mentioned, the supervised pathway is an option that creates this alternative for out-of-staters, but also for folks who are in-state. So let's say you have a student was not successful on the bar exam, they could still prove their competency through a year of practice. And so I just wanted to add that additional comment that the flexibility, I think, is really exciting. And the fact that Oregon is even considering this has really put us at the forefront of innovation in this regard. And we have a lot of eyes on what we're going to do in Oregon from other jurisdictions across the country, and frankly, international folks who are in the vetting process for their respective bars are watching what happens next. So as David mentioned, that next I think the next hearing on the supplemental report is at the end of November. So we'll hear more early next year.
Very exciting. Thank you. Seeing no more questions, thank you, Allie, thank you, David, thank you, Rebecca, so much, and thank you to everyone who stayed and was engaged in our fall seminar today. I know it was a lot of content, but we're very grateful for everybody who attended, and really great turnout for a virtual attendance event. So this is great for OADC. Before we wrap things up this afternoon, I want to make a special call out to JC Talbot and U.S. Legal Support. Not only has U.S. Legal Support offered their platform for us to facilitate the fall seminar virtually, JC has taken his own time to manage the platform not only today, but at the convention in June and last year's fall seminar. Thanks so much, JC. I know we all really appreciate your willingness to step in and lend a helping hand.